All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are talking about the winners and losers of the scouting combine, as well as talking about how the blockbuster trade of Seattle Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson to the Denver Broncos impacts what the Falcons could get for Matt Ryan in a future hypothetical trade, as well as whether this increases the chances that the Falcons maybe be able to trade back at the top of the 2022 NFL Draft.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, writing weekly content for the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons, and of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on any podcast platform that you can find, whether you're listening to Apple or Odyssey or Google or Spotify, as well as also on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and give us a like. When you do, leave a comment and all that jazz. So today's episode, we'll get into the combine winners and losers I was expecting to talk about on yesterday's episode until, Calvin Ridley decided to break at least Falcons Twitter in NFL Twitter. But we got another thing that broke NFL Twitter today on Tuesday, which was the blockbuster trade of Russell Wilson to the Denver Broncos. We also got the news that Aaron Rodgers is staying put with the Green Bay Packers. Thought that was going to be the biggest news of the day. And then shortly thereafter, Denver and Seattle stole their thunder. And so we'll see sort of, the future of those two teams. But we'll discuss it in terms of how it affects the Falcons, because certainly it raises some questions. I think a lot of people are sort of asking, like, why not us when it comes to the Falcons and potentially trading Matt Ryan for a future. And I get that, from certain fans' perspective. You look at a team like Seattle, and I think what they got was 2 firsts, 2 seconds, a mid-round pick this year, and 3 starters in Drew Lock, Noah Fant, and Shelby Harris as part of that trade in exchange for Russell Wilson. And, I think Denver also got a 4th-round pick as part of that package. So you look at that haul, and I'm sure there's a lot of Falcon fans, and I'm sure there's a lot of Falcon fans that would not necessarily agree with this stats, but would look at that and say, man, I would do that any day of the week for Matt Ryan and really add the ammunition to really rebuild and reshape this roster. And it looks like that's my suspicion. Obviously I will defer to Locked On Seahawks for their take on this trade. But, I imagine Seattle's getting the ammunitions for next year's draft to go and get their quarterback of the future and really sort of rebuild this roster, as the last 7 years trying to get back to the Super Bowl with Russell Wilson just really hasn't worked out for them. And they're just sort of starting all over, which is, I think, a notion that a lot of Falcon fans have been, thinking that the Falcons should have begun that process last offseason, should continue that process this offseason, or begin that process next offseason. So when we look at this Russell Wilson trade and we talk about it in the context of the Falcons, you look at that and you say, yeah, if someone offered the Falcons that type of trade value, I think the Falcons would take it in a heartbeat. They would take the $40 million dead money hit from trading Matt Ryan this offseason. But I think, as we've been discussing all offseason long, it's very unlikely that some team is going to want to give that up, because it goes back to the other news that broke today, which is we've been saying, or at least I've been saying, that the world where the Falcons move on from Matt Ryan is a world where other NFL teams get really desperate because Russell Wilson stays put in Seattle, Aaron Rodgers stays put in Green Bay, Deshaun Watson stays put in Houston, and all of a sudden teams start calling the Falcons and their phone starts ringing off the hook, and teams are just, it becomes this bidding war to go out there and get Matt Ryan, because you look at Matt Ryan as the best option for you if you're one of these teams that feels like you have a window to win now, and you don't want to give up assets for Jimmy Garoppolo, who's going to be hurt for the next 6 months. You don't want to give up assets for Carson Wentz, who's now had two, back-to-back disappointing years. And you look at this draft class and you say, I don't know. And you don't want to give up assets for Kirk Cousins as another guy that's sort of rumored to be out there. And Matt Ryan looks pretty good. So does that still exist today? Matt Ryan, in terms of the guys who are left on the market, does Matt Ryan still look like the prettiest gal in the ball, so to speak? Yes, but it doesn't look like with Russell Wilson going, it's similar to this conversation we had last year after the 49ers traded up to Trey Lance. You were looking for one team to probably make a big trade up for a quarterback in last year's draft class, and that was the 49ers swapping with the Panthers or the Dolphins or whoever it was. I'm already blanking on what that trade was. Yeah, it was the Dolphins. I'm sorry. Rather than two teams doing that. And so now that we've gotten one blockbuster trade this offseason, it's very unlikely that we'll get two this offseason. And so, when you're looking at this from, moving on from Matt Ryan, I don't think it necessarily moves the needle in that direction. Again, I think the odds are still very limited that the Falcons move on from Matt Ryan. And before anybody, jumps in the comments and like, oh, you're constantly talking, like, I don't think the Falcons are trading Matt Ryan. We talk about it because it's, what else are we going to talk about? How many conversations can we have about second and third tier free agents at this point in time? But I imagine we'll have a lot more conversations about those guys in the coming weeks as we get into free agency. But the other, I think, thing that a lot of people are looking at this, okay, Seattle's now picking 9th because they're getting that first round pick from the Broncos this year, one of the 2 first-round picks that they're getting in this trade. And so you look at that and you say, oh, they got Drew Lock as sort of a bridge quarterback, but of course they're not invested in Drew Lock long-term. Who could be invested in Drew Lock long-term other than, maybe Dr. Dre or, Jermaine Dupri or whatever, one of these great producers that are going to produce Drew Lock's next album. And like 4 of you get that joke. And I appreciate you for getting that joke and laughing with me on that one. But, I think when you look at Seattle's situation, a quarterback at 9 becomes pretty enticing. Do you look at a player like Malik Willis at that 9 overall spot and say, look, let's go get that guy to replace Russell Wilson instead of, building around Drew Lock? Certainly that's a possibility. And so if you're, a Falcon fan looking at that situation, you're like, okay, well, now if we know a quarterback is going to go in the top 10 and Malik Willis, someone's going to come up and jump Seattle for Malik Willis. And that means they're going to, trade up to 8 to leapfrog the Seahawks. And that means the Falcons can trade back. And I sit here and I go, like, all of the stuff that's going on with the quarterback situation is kind of telling you that it's still very unlikely that a team is going to trade up. As I said earlier, I think Seattle's just basically stocking up for next year's quarterback class. I also think that, you don't necessarily see too many teams trading up for anything other than quarterbacks, although we'll talk in a second about, one possibility out there. But, the fact that Washington was a team that was rumored to offer more than what Denver offered, but Seattle wound up trading Russell to Denver because he preferred to go there and they wanted to trade him to the AFC. The fact that Washington is going hard after a veteran quarterback, and we'll see if they wind up landing someone like an Andy Dalton or Jimmy Garoppolo or whoever the case may be. But it kind of tells you that they're not in love with these quarterbacks. No one's in love with these quarterbacks, right? The fact that Mitch Trubisky, we're going to talk about combine winners and losers later in today's episode, but it sounds like, of the quarterbacks, Mitch Trubisky won the combine at that position because he's the guy that, generated the most buzz over the weekend. And he's going to get, a lot of offers this offseason, as well as some other veteran quarterbacks like Teddy Bridgewater and Jameis Winston and whoever else, because they don't love the quarterback. So this idea that some team is going to, fall in love with one of these quarterbacks in the draft, all the context clues, let's call it that, is telling you that's not happening, guys. So I think if you're hoping the Falcons are going to trade back because someone wants to come and get a quarterback, it's unlikely. And we know that teams generally do not trade up for anything other than quarterbacks. However, the one caveat, and we'll talk about this position coming up on today's episode, maybe the Falcons could trade back now that Seattle's picking in the top 10, because Seattle could be looking at a pass rusher. And this edge group is looking pretty, premium at this point in time. We'll talk a little bit more about that on today's episode. But you look at it and you say maybe a team like Philadelphia, who has 3 first-round picks, their first one being 15, the rumors are that they really want to go out and get an edge rusher in this draft. I've heard them connected to David Ojabo, and maybe they get hungry for Ojabo or somebody else. And with, it looks like we might have 3 or 4 edges go off the board in the top 10 of this draft now coming out of the combine. And one of those teams like Philadelphia is getting itchy that their guy's not going to be there at 15 where they're picking. And so they're willing to come up and get their guy, offer a second round pick to the Falcons or whatever the case may be. And then maybe the Falcons can trade back. They might miss out on one of those premium edges. Maybe there'll still be an edge like a George Karlaftis there at 15. Maybe they go out and get a Jordan Davis there at 15 if you're in that boat. Maybe they're now in the position to take a wide receiver to potentially replace Calvin Ridley at that point. Maybe they're willing to take one of the cornerbacks that seemingly that we were talking about possibly taking at 8. Some of those guys might be still available at 15. We'll talk about who those guys might be as well later on today's episode. So I think if you're still holding out on this hope for the Falcons to trade back in round 1, I don't think it's because of the Russell Wilson trade increases the odds of that. I think you're hoping that some teams fall in love with some of these edges and are willing to pay a premium to go get their guy in this draft class in the top 10, and a team like Philadelphia may be willing to give up a second round pick to move up 7 spots to go get their guy. And if you're a Falcon fan, you're like, I'll take a second round pick plus one of these other guys, maybe a lesser edge or one of these other defensive players or a wide receiver to trade out of that spot. So if you're still holding out hope on a trade back, I think that's really what you need to hold on to, and we'll just sort of see how things play out over the next I think we're like 7 weeks away from the draft, so we'll sort of see. But with that being said, let's move on and talk about some of the combine winners and losers, starting with the edge rushers and some of the guys that may now be in the conversation for the Falcons as well as other teams at that 8th overall spot or in the top 10 of this upcoming 2022 NFL draft. But before we get there, guys, we're getting close to draft time. We're also getting close to, St. Patty's party time. And, we know that McDonald's is out there throwing out their Shamrock Shakes. And if you're the type of person that always enjoys a Shamrock Shake this time of year, well, Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the market, is being very seasonal with their white chocolate shamrock flavor. But if you're not into Shamrock Shakes, that doesn't sound necessarily interesting to you, a mix of white chocolate and mint, there's other combinations that you can find at Built Bar, like coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream, churro puff, banana cream pie, and so much more. Go find the flavor that you love and find the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, but even better than a candy bar, because Built Bars taste good, but they're good for you as well. Low in sugar, low in calories, low in carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. And you can find all of these new flavors at built.com. And when you go there, use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your first order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So let's talk combine winners and losers, and let's talk about the edge rusher group, right? We've talked before about how the team's 2 primary needs are arguably edge rusher and cornerback, and those are going to be the position groups that we are going to talk about today, because it impacts, that all important, that all meaningful, that, draft selection at 8th overall that's going to decide the fate of the universe, as so many of you guys believe. So let's talk about, this edge rusher group, and we're talking about combine winner. I think Travon Walker, as well as so many other players at Georgia, we already talked about Jordan Davis on Monday, so many Georgia players won the combine, and Travon Walker is included in that. And there was growing buzz heading into the week. You had guys like The Athletic's Dan Brugler, you had NFL.com's Daniel Jeremiah that were ranking Travon Walker in the top 10. We talked before when we did the Kayvon Thibodeaux mock draft Monday a week ago. We talked about how Daniel Jeremiah was hearing that teams were valuing Travon Walker over Kayvon Thibodeaux. And I think based off of Travon Walker's very impressive testing at the combine this past weekend, he solidified himself as a top 10 pick, potentially as a top 5 pick. His athletic testing was very similar to players like Myles Garrett from a size, frame, length standpoint. In terms of athletically, he out-tested a guy like Ziggy Ansah, who was an athletic freak and a top 5 pick back in that 2013 draft class. And so there's still some questions about Travon Walker and how he was utilized at Georgia, and a lot of sort of projecting his skill set at the NFL level from a pure sort of size, frame, physical athleticism standpoint. He is arguably the most physically gifted edge in this draft class and one of the more physically gifted players on the Georgia defense. And that really stood out for me watching the film, which was part of the reason why I was anti-Jordan Davis. I'm like, he's not even the best player on that defensive line. But no more. We're not on the anti-Jordan Davis kick anymore, as we explained on Monday. But I think Travon Walker proved to anybody that was still skeptical that he is one of these premier athletes in this draft class over the weekend. You can maybe term Kayvon Thibodeaux as a loser. Again, it's hard to say because you get this sort of mixed information with Kayvon Thibodeaux that, Peter King of NBC Sports quoted an NFL GM who called him a me guy. And we've talked before about Thibodeaux and the perception of his, persona or attitude or whatever the case may be, his effort, his fire, all these various things. I don't necessarily have those concerns. My main concern is the fact that Kayvon Thibodeaux didn't really progress and develop as a pass rusher over the course of his time at Oregon. I don't know why I stumbled on that word. And so I do wonder a little bit about where Kayvon Thibodeaux is. And it does seem like, he didn't do I don't think he did anything major to hurt himself at the combine, but I don't think he necessarily, at least again, based off of the whispers and the buzz or whatever, really did anything to help himself. Now, one of the other things we talked about going into the combine was sort of this glut of edges in the middle of the first round, the David Ojabo, Jermaine Johnson, George Karlaftis. I think all three of those guys helped themselves, or at least solidified themselves as sort of guys that are going the top half of the first round. I think Jermaine Johnson has been killing it this entire offseason, starting with the Senior Bowl and continuing it this past weekend at the Combine. And, from what I've heard, whispers that he really impressed in some of the interviews and whatnot. So he's a guy that I think may have solidified himself as a top 10 pick. There were people going into the Combine that was talking about him coming out of the Senior Bowl as a top 10 pick. And I was like, I'm not buying it quite yet, but I am starting to buy it. And I do think guys like Jermaine Johnson, in addition to Travon Walker and Kayvon Thibodeaux, are certainly sort of the premier guys that are probably going to be in the conversation for the Falcons if they do choose to go for an edge rusher at that 8th overall spot. And as far as I'm concerned, all three of those guys, bring sort of comparable skill sets to the table from a physical standpoint. It's just a question of who do you believe is going to be that sort of alpha pass rusher in the NFL, and hopefully sooner rather than later, is the one that I think personally, if I'm consulting the Falcons in their draft meetings and saying that's the guy you should wind up taking at that spot. And I think you can make a case that Jermaine Johnson, given that he's probably the most polished of these pass rushers, he may not have the same sort of tools that Thibodeaux and Walker have from an athleticism point or the standpoint, or he's not far behind, but he's probably the most, like, what he is, what he is, so I think you can make the argument that his floor is a little bit higher than even those two players moving forward at the next level. So he's a guy that I think helped himself. Talking about some of the day 2 and day 3 edges that won or lost the Combine, I think Amari Barno from Virginia Tech and Arnold Ebiketie from Penn State certainly were winners. Barno timed the fastest 40 among the edge group of 4.36, had some of the best jumps at that position group. He was a day 3 guy. Sort of his pre-draft rankings were sort of projecting him somewhere in that 5th, 6th round range as sort of a developmental project for certain teams. And I think because of the impressive Combine, he certainly moved himself up as sort of a probably a day 3 guy, but a priority, like round 4 guy, one of those guys that typically goes in the top, 10 picks of round 4, or a guy that could potentially sneak into, the top 100 at the end of round 3. Arnold Ebiketie has been a guy that has been ranked consistently by a lot of people in that like 35 to 50 range. So an early 2nd round pick on a lot of people's draft board rankings. But when we're talking about this edge class and seeing, a half dozen guys go in the top 15, 20 picks, right? And I feel like we're going to get 6 edges definitely in round 1. It's just a question of how high they go with Aiden Hutchinson, Travon Walker, Kayvon Thibodeaux, Jermaine Johnson, David Ojabo, and George Karlaftis. And I think Ebiketie, with his testing, running a good 40 and jumping well and showing that explosiveness that he showed on film, has certainly solidified himself as an edge 7 in this draft class. And that's a guy for some of these teams that will miss out on one of these quote unquote big 6 edge rushers early at the top half of round 1. One of these teams picking in the latter half of round 1 may be able to pull the trigger on a guy like Arnold Ebiketie, in the 20s or something like that. So we could definitely see 7 edges go in the first round. And then another player that probably helped himself, didn't have necessarily the monster testing that I think a lot of people were projecting based off of Bruce Feldman's sort of freak list, but did test very well, was Boye Mafe from Minnesota. And I know people coming out of Senior Bowl were saying, oh, he's going to be a top 50 pick. And I was like, I don't know. I don't think he's going to be in the top, 7 or 8 edges that will probably go in the top 50 this year. But it does seem like he's at least by default, certainly the front runner to potentially be edge 8 after Ebiketie, particularly because some of the other guys that are being projected as day 2 guys didn't really do anything that really helped themselves at the combine. You had South Carolina's Kingsley and Igbari run a slow 40, a 4.87. He had some good jumps, but didn't necessarily run a good 40 time. Mijai Sanders, lost about 14 pounds between the Senior Bowl and the combine due to an illness that affected his testing. Cameron Thomas, who suffered a hamstring injury at the Senior Bowl and basically missed that week, also did not really do anything other than the bench at the combine. And those are some guys that have been consistently projected to sort of be round 2 sort of edge rushers that could be, edge 7, 8, 9 or whatever, and prevent a guy like Mafe, and maybe he's the 10th guy that goes late in round 2 or early in round 3 or something like that. And those guys didn't really help themselves, and we'll see what they do at the pro day to maybe get their names back on the map and be in the mix as some of these early round 2 guys, or maybe they're potentially guys that may wind up falling to round 3 now instead. So we'll just sort of have to see how that goes. But I'm sitting here today feeling a lot more when it comes to the Falcons' first round pick that it's likely going to be an edge rusher, because before I was thinking, oh, they could definitely take a cornerback with that 8th overall selection. But I think a couple of guys didn't necessarily help themselves at the combine, and we'll get into some of the combine winners and losers at that cornerback position. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On NFL podcast, which you can find free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. And make sure you subscribe to the Locked On NFL podcast, because they're giving you the breakdowns of all the big news going on around the NFL. It's going to be an absolute sprint between now and the start of the league year. So definitely want to check out Locked On NFL to get the insight from all those guys on all the big stories around the NFL. So going into the combine a couple of weeks ago, we talked about sort of this cornerback class and the difference between what a top 10 sort of corner looks like. So if the Falcons are potentially going to take a corner at that 8th overall spot, there's a certain sort of check marks and check boxes that corners have to check, and it is heavily based off of the last 12 years of drafts, heavily off of height, weight, speed, and length. And we were looking primarily at Cincinnati's Sauce Gardner, LSU's Derek Stingley, and Washington's Trent McDuffie as the 3 guys that would be the possible candidates. And I think of that 3, Sauce Gardner was the winner of the combine because he checked all the boxes. 6'3", 190 pounds. That's a little light, but, workable. 33 plus inch arms. And when we talk about these top 10 corners, when you go back through the history over the last decade plus, 33 inch arms is kind of the hallmark of being a top 10 corner with that sort of plus trait. So I think if you had concerns about Sauce's long speed, I didn't necessarily have that concern watching the film, but he checked that box with a 4.41 40 time. And so I think he checked all the boxes that you needed to check to be CB1. I have been projecting Sauce as CB1 basically since, the end of December. And so, the rest of the world is now catching up to the prophet known as Aaron Freeman, who was projecting Sauce to be CB1 and be drafted ahead of guys like Stingley and Trent McDuffie. And, I know a lot of Falcon fans, because of that, are very much firmly on the idea of drafting Sauce at the 8th overall spot. And I certainly think he's in the mix there. But part of the reason why I'm not optimistic about the Falcons landing Sauce is because I think he's going to be gone by the time the 8th overall spot gets selected. And, the Giants, the Jets are two cornerback needy teams that Sauce checks the same boxes, if not more of the boxes that he checks than Atlanta, because they like those long press man type of corners. And I do not see him getting past either one of those teams picking at 4, 5, and 7. So I would not expect Sauce to get past 3 times essentially in a row. And you can technically throw the Panthers in that conversation as well, because, they drafted JC Horn last year, but, Stephon Gilmore's probably on the way out. AJ Bouye may be on the way out, and CJ Henderson certainly did not look like a hit for them after they traded for him. So they might be looking for another cornerback. Dante Jackson's also a free agent. So there's going to be some turmoil there for them at the cornerback position, but they may have bigger fish to fry at the tackle or quarterback position. So we'll just sort of see how that plays out for them. But long story short, I don't expect Sauce to be there at 8. So when you hear me say I'm not going to be including Sauce in my potential Falcon fits probably for some time, unless, the math changes there, because I do not expect him to get past the Giants at 7. In terms of guys that lost the combine, that we're looking at you, Trent McDuffie. We're looking at you, Derek Stingley, because they did not measure up. Emphasis on the term measure when it came to this combine. Trent McDuffie came in with 29 3/4 inch arms, sub 30-inch arms, and we talked about how he needed to measure in with 31-inch arms. And again, I'm sure a lot of people are listening like, what's the difference between 1.25 inches, 1.25 inches? Is that big a deal? And it's probably in the long scheme of things, is probably not that big a deal in terms, but NFL teams perceive it to be that big a deal because you look at the last 12 drafts in the round 1, there hasn't been a cornerback with sub 30-inch arms taken in that round. And so I sit here and I say it's a possibility. I don't think it's a likelihood, but it's a possibility that Trent McDuffie went from a guy that potentially could have been the 8th overall selection a couple of weeks ago, at least if you were listening to the Locked On Falcons podcast, to a guy that may not go in round 1 at all. And so we'll just sort of have to see what happens. But I think he's certainly not going to be in the mix for a top 10 corner based off of NFL history, and probably may fall into the latter half of round 1. I know Dane Brugler on his mock draft that he put out Tuesday had him going 15 to Philadelphia. So we'll see about that. But we'll just sort of have to see if a team picking in the bottom half of round 1, they're going to, I think, because of that short arm length, NFL teams are going to be like, he can't play on the outside. He doesn't have the length to play, press on the outside. And so we're going to have to move him to the nickel. And that's a similar reality that happened for a former teammate of Trent McDuffie at Washington, and Byron Murphy, who in that 2019 draft, going into that process was hailed as one of the top corners and wound up going with the first overall spot in the round 2, the 33rd overall selection, and has primarily been a nickel corner with the Cardinals these last couple of years. And I could see NFL teams sort of pigeonholing Trent McDuffie as a similar prospect this year. And so we'll see if a team picking the latter half of round 1 values him and values that nickel cornerback spot enough to pull the trigger on a Trent McDuffie if they sort of pigeonhole him in that role. And talking about Derek Stingley, another guy that measured, 30 5/8 inch arms, which is not nearly as bad as 29 3/4. There have been cornerbacks taken in round 1 with 30 5/8 inch arms or shorter, but a lot of them are not particularly successful. Basically, the one guy with like sub 31-inch arms in over the last 12 years that has been, truly successful in the NFL is guys like Jason Verrett and Prince Amukamara. And Amukamara kind of peaked as a high-level number 2 corner, and Jason Verrett was a very good corner, number 1 type of guy, but always dealt with injuries due to his smaller stature. So, again, a guy like Stingley with, using that measurable as sort of the end-all be-all probably is not fair. But it is one of those things where, NFL teams look at these things and say, oh, okay, like if you don't hit these benchmarks, it's about making bets, right? And if we know that, the Vernon Hargreaves and the Dre Kirkpatricks and the Damon Arnett's and these guys that were, to the top 20 picks that didn't necessarily turn into, number 1 type of corners, you're betting on a guy like Derek Stingley to be more of the outlier. And then you already had the other question marks surrounding Stingley with sort of his lack of production these last couple of years, the injury concerns, all these various things. So, I think if there was any expectation that Derek Stingley was going to be a top 10 pick, and I didn't necessarily have those expectations going into the combine. I had been consistently putting him at 12 in my mocks. I know Dane Brugler had him at 12 to the Vikings in his most recent mock. I don't think Derek Stingley helped himself, and probably will go somewhere in the middle of the first round, somewhere in that 10 to 20-ish range, assuming all the other issues and all those other boxes are checked for him. As far as teams are willing to sign off on that. So we'll just sort of have to see about that. But, I think because of, the combine hurting guys like McDuffie and Stingley based off of the measurables, the guys that were helped at the combine didn't necessarily have to do a ton to help themselves, because those guys just basically checked those boxes. Andrew Booth came in with 31 plus inch arms. Kaiir Elam came in with 30 7/8 inch, so almost 31 inches, ran a 4.39 40. That certainly helped him. Tariq Woolen, a 6'4" guy that had 33 plus inch arms, ran a 4.26, definitely helped himself. And some of these guys, were maybe being projected going into the week, as sort of, latter half of the first round, second round sort of guys now may be able to push themselves. Booth may leapfrog now into the top 15. For some of these cornerback needy teams being like, we want a guy that has a little bit more length than a Stingley or a McDuffie, and you might see a team like Minnesota taking a guy like Booth at 12 over some of these other guys. And I know a lot of people already had Booth rated that highly anyway, so it won't take much for some of those other teams to be convinced to take a guy like Andrew Booth as CB2 rather than maybe CB4 or 5, where maybe some people were projecting him. Kaiir Elam's another guy that, was being pushed down in round 2, maybe pushed back into round 1. Tariq Woolen, another guy that could sort of sneak into that. Kyler Gordon had 31 inch arms, didn't necessarily run a fast 40 at 5.452. But certainly because of that length and the perceived athleticism that he has, some team will probably pull the trigger on him in the 20s. The same thing with Martin Emerson, who I think a lot of people were projecting purely to be a round 2 guy, but because he had 33.5 inch arms, ran a okay 40 at 4.53, could potentially sneak into the latter part of round 2. So, it's possible we're sitting here today, guys, that, a guy like Trent McDuffie, who, a week ago I was sitting here projecting to be, the Falcons' 8th overall selection. There's a chance. I'm not saying it's a likely chance, but there's a chance he could fall all the way to 43 for the Falcons or something like that. So, that's kind of where I'm at with this Falcons, group or this cornerback group when it comes to how it affects the Falcons. And we'll just sort of have to talk a little bit more about the combine as well as this draft cycle. We have a guest, ESPN's Jordan Reed, coming on the podcast for tomorrow's episode and get his thoughts on what the Falcons should or should not do, as well as some of his thoughts coming off of the combine on tomorrow's episode. But of course, guys, make sure you stay tuned to the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast, where Ryan Tracy and Eric Crocker are giving you the lowdown each and every day about this combine and how it impacts the draft, how these big trades and free agent signings and the franchise tags affect the draft. So go check out the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast, free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. And of course, if you want to provide your feedback on anything I've discussed on today's episode, you can do so by hitting me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. That will do it for us here, guys. Until then.